Well, happy Tuesday, everyone, and welcome to the Essentials of Architectural Control, one of our seminars in the C.I.A. Services Seminar Series, and we're pleased to provide another webcast. Have a good group of folks who've joined us tonight. In a few minutes, I'd like to shout out to a couple of them that have been here to a number of the webcasts. But first of all, just the format as usual. All of you received in advance the slides that we'll be going through tonight. You also received a thick package of 64 pages worth of samples, reports, and all sorts of other good things that apply to tonight's webinar. Throughout the evening, please feel free to write your questions in the chat box that was sent to you, the link that was sent to you earlier. And we have a moderator who will come up here right now who will be able to answer some of the questions and pass some of the questions on to me. So I'm really pleased to be joined by Tina Jameson. Tina is an Executive Vice President with C.I.A. Services here in the San Antonio area. And she is the branch manager for both our San Antonio office and our Bandera office. So Tina will be assisting. If you have any questions, that's who you'll be chatting to. We do have a good number of folks and volunteers and communities who have registered for tonight's webcast. And I just want to point out a couple and thank them for being here. Starting with one of our newer communities, we actually have 5 folks from Bridlewood Estates, from Bridlegate Ranch, as well as one person from Bridlewood Estates. And so all 4 of the 5 committee members on the ACC from Bridlegate are here. We have John from Highland Meadows, and if you ever get a reservation coming from John, you know he's probably having pizza and cookies that he's willing to share if you want to visit his house. We also have Donna, Liz, and Penny from Flying L Ranch. They've been to everyone, folks from Flying L have been to every one of our webcasts so far, so we're real pleased that they've rejoined us. And one of my very favorite board members from Summerwood, Barbara, has joined us tonight. I haven't seen her since a webinar several years ago in Houston. Many, many more. Tom and Heather from Chavano Forest and many others, but I just wanted to specifically mention them. Let's go ahead and talk about what we're going to be going over tonight, and that's on the agenda. So we'll be talking about the purpose of architectural control, very importantly the basis and limits of authority of an architectural control committee. We'll be talking about their composition and role relative to the board of directors, relative to owners. We'll be spending a bit of time on guidelines. Guidelines are one of the best tools an architectural control committee has to help owners understand the requirements and to consistently enforce whatever the decisions are and requirements are for the association. We'll go through the review process, how we communicate decisions, and then importantly, how we enforce decisions of the ACC. We'll touch on the appeal process, go through some sample reports, and then I've got one case study at the end I'd like to go through to see how well you're listening and understand what we've gone through this evening. So that's the agenda. Let's get started with what the purpose is. As we talk about in most of these webcasts, many of the questions, many of our authorities and responsibilities and our procedures are listed in the governing documents of the association. It's no different for what the architectural control function is all about. It's in the governing documents. So let's touch on what our purpose is, and then we'll go into our limits of responsibilities in just a moment. But the purpose is going to be listed somewhere in generally the deed restrictions or the CC&Rs. Here's one that's listed right here. The community derives its unique character from a mix of compatible architectural styles and from the cooperation of all builders and owners in upholding the minimum design, landscaping, and aesthetic standards. So there's always a goal, a lofty purpose of the Architectural Control Committee. That is just one document, but if you look at yours, it will have what the purpose is as your developer of the community envisioned for architectural control. Most importantly, the architectural control function clarifies what expectations are, what the community standards are for the owners, and it provides a consistent basis for the association through its board or ACC in its future decision making. The governing documents will provide for a body, an authority, who will be making all the decisions relative to ACC, whether it's the developer, whether it's the board, whether it's an architectural control committee, or some other combination. And then it will clarify to owners what they must submit to the committee for a decision. Overall, just as the deed restrictions for a community are meant to protect property values, the architectural standards are an integral part of that goal of protecting property values. So let's look at some of the things that we deal with in architectural control. Certainly at the beginning of an association and as development continues, we're dealing with new homes. You see several homes under construction here. On the left-hand side, you see two homes that are in the hill country. On the right-hand side, you see two homes that are in the more urban settings. We also deal with structural modification. So after the home is built, upper left, we have a garage converted into a living space. Here we can see something that merges from architectural control into deed restriction violation type issues. We have a room addition, a second story being added onto the back of a home over the garage. We have a structural room addition on the left bottom, and on the right bottom we have a patio cover. Those who have been to the deed restriction seminars have heard the whole story about that cover over the driveway. I won't repeat it here, but if you haven't heard it, send me an email. It's too long for Tina to chat the answer on that one. We have new structures that are built that are either ancillary structures, outbuildings, or things of that sort. We have a beautiful outdoor kitchen, upper left. We have a very colorful and tall play structure on the upper right. Bottom left, storage buildings, storage sheds, workshops, very popular. Many of those are submitted. And then we have a swimming pool under construction in a backyard. So those are new structures. We also deal with the maintenance that occurs on properties. So here's a whole lot of house colors. You would have seen these in various seminars that we've had also. My two favorite are the bottom right. That is a roof. That is a real color. That is not touched up at all. The owner thought they were painting it a nice copper color. They didn't quite get it right. And the upper left is another one of my favorites. Not that I'm against green. If you see the shirt I have on is very similar to the color of that door. But I just wanted to point out that the green on the house is much greener than the green on the grass. So, but that's a deed restriction issue. Moving on, even things like decorative, what we call decorative embellishments could come under the authority of the Architectural Control Committee. It's not always just structures. It can be aesthetic things. So here we see various nice decorative touches, but some communities have the authority to regulate even the decorative things that may be around properties. And finally, we'll see in a minute, some associations actually do have the authority to regulate landscaping, some don't. We'll examine what your documents may say and determine the extent of what an ACC, Architectural Control Authority, can regulate. All right, so now that we've seen all those pretty and interesting pictures, let's talk about the basis of authority. Why does an association in general, and specifically an Architectural Control Committee, get to ask people to submit information before they can do things? Well, that authority is in the deed restrictions themselves. It's the document that's filed before people buy their properties, and it attaches to the land. It's something that is an obligation on the land, just like mowing your grass, just like paying your assessments. Submitting things to the Architectural Control Committee is something that comes with the land. So the CC&Rs talk about the owner's obligation for that advance review. It will, in the CC&Rs, describe a process for reviewing applications and the requirement of what an owner must submit to the committee in general. It provides that there is a committee or some body, some entity that gets to review and make decisions regarding applications that come in. And then it finally will describe what the scope of the committee's authority is and any limitations on their authority. We're going to examine those very closely in just a moment. In addition, and this only applies if you look at the very bottom line of this slide, Chapter 204 of the Texas Property Code only applies in the greater Houston area to 3 counties, Montgomery County, Harris County, and Galveston County. If you've been through some of the other seminars, you know about bracketing of Texas laws, where a state law can be written that only applies to limited areas. 204 is a great chapter of the Texas Property Code, but only applies to 3 counties. Relative to ACC, what it provides is for continuation of authority. Many documents that were written in the 1980s, 1970s, and before provided only an architectural control authority that expired after 10 or 20 years. The developer put it in there, he wanted to make sure the homes were built like he wanted, and then it went away. Well, Chapter 204 provides a mechanism for continuing that authority. So it exists for the life of the association and not something that could expire. And so that's what 204 is. If you happen to be in Montgomery, Harris, or Galveston County, and you have old documents, maybe defective documents, 204 can come to your rescue. The rest of the state, we need to deal with that in other ways if you're in that situation. So, the CC&Rs has what we refer to as an establishment clause, just like in the Constitution. But we have an establishment clause which indicates that an architectural control authority exists. The wording in there varies significantly, so we're going to examine the parts of an establishment clause and how those might read in your community and what they mean. So the first thing it says are what improvements are included. In other words, what would an owner need to submit to the Architectural Control Committee? The language here is very typical. They would need to submit buildings, fences, patios, pools, garages, paving, fencing, or any other structure or improvement. So notice what it says there in that particular clause for that community. There's nothing about landscaping in there. However, what it does say is or improvement. And if you go back to the beginning of the document and read the definitions, you'll see whether or not improvement includes landscaping. If it does, then landscaping is within the authority of the Architectural Control Committee in your community. So it's very important to look at that clause to determine whether or not someone needs to submit If they're going to put a little fountain in their front yard, is that something that does fall within the authority of the Architectural Control Committee? The Establishment Clause also deals with what activities are covered. In this particular document, it says anything that's erected, placed, or altered on any lot. That "or altered" is very important, because if you didn't have that, it's only basically something you build or drag onto the lot. Once it's there, you would not have any authority to ask people to submit when they're about to repaint their house, or put a new roof on the house, or tear down their fence and build it in another place. And so we need to look at the language to see the limit of our authority. What is the decision criteria that the ACC uses? This is important, and it's normally a very generic term like this, that the ACC will look at things and make decisions as to its conformity and harmony of external design with existing structures within the properties, and as to location with respect to topography and finished grade elevation. That first part that talks about harmony is very broad. That gives a committee the authority to look at the aesthetic issues to determine if this fits in. That's basically what it's saying. Does this fit in with the community? And then finally, on this section of the Establishment Clause, who makes that decision? It will state by an Architectural Control Committee composed of, and go on to what that entity, what that body is that will be making these decisions. It will also talk about when a decision must be made. Very commonly it says a bunch of words and then within 30 days, basically within 30 days of receipt of a completed application. The number that's most common is 30, but often we see 40 or 60. And then there are a few documents that are totally silent on the time frame, which means someone could submit something and the committee may have up to 6 months. Clearly that is not a good situation, but there are some, again, documents which are silent. The most common time is 30 days. And that 30 days, that time frame, is tied into what happens if a decision isn't made. And I'm about to read this, but keep in mind that this document was written by a developer, and what the developer always wants to do is sell land, make profits, finish out the community. What developers in general don't like to do is handle paperwork. And so the default that's written into most documents is what's stated right here. It says, in the event that the committee fails to approve or disapprove such design, materials, location plan within, in this case, 45 days after said plans specifications have been submitted to it, such approval will not be required, and this covenant will deem to have been fully complied with. This is sometimes referred to as a default approval. It's a situation we never want to get into. I'll talk about why in a little bit, but default approvals can lead to all sorts of challenges. Now, it's important to recognize all this is saying is that if you submit something, it is not responded to, that you as an owner have done your job. You've complied with this obligation to submit something. It hasn't said it's approved. It hasn't said it's disapproved, which is what can get us into problems if we don't like it. But it hasn't said it's approved. It simply said you've done what you needed to, go on and build your home, go on and do whatever you said you were going to do. It does not, a default approval does not give someone the authority to violate the deed restrictions, to build a home over a setback line, to build a fence larger, taller than it should be. It simply indicates you've submitted your stuff and we can move on. And so that is the normal phrasing. There are some CC&Rs, however, that default to disapproved. In other words, if you have not received a response over 30 days, it is deemed to have been disapproved. That's a lot safer for associations and ACCs, but it's very unusual to have that in there, and it doesn't change our responsibility as an ACC to respond to every request that comes in on a timely manner. And so that's everything that I've just covered in the last 3 slides is all about the establishment clause. What creates the association's ACC authority? And it's something you definitely should read that paragraph with the insight that I've just provided about all those words meaning something. So let's start with, I've been calling it ACC throughout, and that's common in our industry to refer to these committees as the ACC, the Architectural Control Committee. But the names are all over the place. They're going to be in the establishment clause as to what the name is in your organization. So we have Architectural Control Committee, Architectural Review Committee, Design Review Committee, Modifications Committee, New Construction Committee, Architectural Control Authority, and it goes on and on. In some cases, mostly in newer developments and a lot of cases the master plan developments, we actually have 2 or 3 entities out there. So we'll have, and the developer does this for a purpose, we'll have a new construction committee. And the new construction committee has authority over all brand new homes being built. That's what the developer wants to be in strong control of, so there's a new construction committee. In addition, there is a modifications committee, and that's for anything that is added after the new home is built. The developer is very willing to hand that off to residents to be making decisions on swimming pools and sheds in the backyard and decorative embellishments and landscaping, whatever else might be there. So that works very nicely on a new community, a larger community where you have a lot of activity. The developer is able to keep control over new home construction, but lets everything else happen with the modifications committee. So your entity has a name. Throughout tonight, we'll be referring to it as the ACC, the Architectural Control Committee. Now, the membership of the committee is initially either written into the CC&Rs. In the older documents, it would actually name 3 people: Joe Smith, Mary Jones, and Harvey Wallbanger. You know, it would have those names right there in the CC&Rs. That's not done anymore. There's nothing wrong with that, but that's not the way that new documents are written. Typically, it provides in the CC&Rs that the developer has the authority to appoint the members. And it doesn't name them in particular, but it gives the developer the authority. Eventually, over time, as the community is maturing in its development, and when the developer is no longer there, the authority is going to transfer to either the board of directors, to a committee that self-appoints itself, that was originally developer appointees and converts to maybe board appointees, or maybe the developer has set it up as a totally separate committee, separate from the board of directors. I'm going to touch on that organization in just a moment. One of the groups, actually 2 of the groups that are on this webcast tonight are actually set up that way. So we'll touch about that. Regarding the membership of the ACC, the document will generally indicate that the ACC can appoint a representative to act on its behalf. You generally think about that is in the way that if you have, for example, a 5-member ACC, they can designate among themselves that one person will act as the chairperson of the ACC, and that person will be the designated representative to maybe interact with us, the management company. That's a great approach. But it goes a little further. It could mean that the committee could designate one member to make all the decisions. If that's the case, why do you have a committee? And that's not really a thing that you would want to do. What we have found in a couple of our communities, we only have a small number who do it this way, maybe 5% of our communities take advantage of this, is if you have a community, for example, that receives a pretty high level of applications each month, where you're talking about 10 or 15 or in some cases 60 is probably our top community, applications per month. Many of those applications are going to be pretty standard. The example I like to give is roofing. There's only so many styles of shingles, there's only so many manufacturers, there's only so many colors. It's very easy for a committee to write guidelines for roofing and say, C.I.A. services, anytime a roofing application comes in, we delegate to you the authority to make these decisions according to our written guidelines that we have adopted and published. The nice thing about that approach is some percentage of the applications that come in, and within a couple days, a decision is back to the homeowner. Whereas if that particular community has a committee that only meets once a month, on average the response time would be 15, 16, 18 days for the response time on a roofing application versus a 2 or 3 day if that authority is limited, the limited authority is given to C.I.A. services. Something to think about. We don't request that authority, but if it's something that would work in your situation, we're happy to do it. Again, where you already have clear written guidelines. So, how does the committee continue? Well, it depends. Again, a community in development has what's called a declarant control period. It may be called other things, but basically a declarant control period is a period of time in which the developer has the right to appoint and replace ACC members. And there are other authorities the developer has during that time. So during that period, clearly, the developer can make those appointments. Many times the appointments are developer employees, but they can make those appointments during that period and replace them as employees change. After that period, the authority would transition to the board of directors in those situations. In most cases, the CC&Rs, however, provide for that the members of the ACC are appointed by the board and can be replaced any time by the board. In other words, it's a traditional committee of the association. And just like the social committee members could be appointed or replaced, the ACC members could be appointed or replaced. In some cases, the documents are set up such that the committee itself is the one who self-perpetuates itself. So the committee has 3 members, one person moves away, the remaining 2 members appoint the replacement. And it just self-perpetuates over time. Finally, in a few associations, and again, Bridlegate and Bridlewood Estates, who happen to be listening to us tonight, are both associations where the members of the ACC are elected, just like board members. They're elected at the annual meeting each year, and the ACC members are elected. In one of those situations, they're elected for a 1-year period, and every year the whole ACC can turn over. In the other case, the ACC members are elected for specific terms. So just like board members, you have ACC members who are elected, and not all of them turn over every year. They have a specific term that is staggered. Filling vacancies is generally not even covered in those documents. And so, since it's an elected position, if it's not covered, when a vacancy occurs, the questions go up, we get in a legal opinion, how do we fill this vacancy? Do we wait until the next annual meeting? Or, in the case of one of the entities who's listening tonight, the board of directors feels they have the authority to fill vacancies, and then at the annual meetings, the elections occur. So now that we've talked about the composition of the committee, let's look at their role relative to the board of directors. Clearly, the ACC has a very important and great deal of authority in the association. So what's their role? Their primary role is to receive applications from owners and to make decisions. They're a decision-making body. The governing documents, whether it's the deed restrictions or various guidelines that the association has created, may also create some additional responsibilities for the ACC, and it varies greatly between communities. They may monitor construction for compliance, and that is more something we see in communities where there's still building going on, custom home communities where developers are selling lots and then leaving, but property owners are building on their homes for many years off into the future. So in that case, the ACC often is just keeping an eye on the construction, making sure that they're following the rules, that it appears they're building that two-story house when they said they were building a two-story house. They will assess fines. In some cases, they have the authority to actually, the ACC is the one who can determine that fines get applied if that's allowed in a community. In other cases, they recommend fines and the board of directors has the authority to actually implement the fines. It's only if fines are allowed in that particular community. If there are deposits that are required prior to certain types of construction, the ACC is the one who would authorize the refund of that construction deposit. And finally, there are cases where a variance is needed as part of construction, maybe because of the topography of the lot, that the home needs to be built a little closer to a side property line, or a storage building maybe needs to go a little closer to the rear building line. The ACC would have the authority either to grant a variance, or if they don't have that authority to grant, to recommend to the board that the board grant a variance. So those are all things that an ACC may have and situations which may come up. Let's now move over to the board of directors. And this doesn't matter if they're independently elected entities or if they're appointed entities. The committee makes decisions. The board is the one who follows up on enforcing those decisions. The ACC doesn't say, go to the attorney. The board of directors is the one who says, yep, they have not done what they were supposed to, and therefore we are going to follow up with communications and eventually potentially legal action. So the board is the one who is generally detecting and following up on activity by owners that require ACC review. So if someone is putting a new roof on their house, we're glad if ACC members say, hey, a new roof's going on, they haven't come through the committee, but it's the board, through the management company's responsibility to detect that work is happening and then follow up with the owner. If the ACC disapproves something, the board is the one who must enforce that disapproval, require that something be relocated or changed or modified to meet the ACC's requirements. It's not the ACC who's doing that, it's the association through the board of directors. And finally, the board of directors is where the appeal process goes. So under state law, under Texas Property Code, an owner has a right to appeal a decision of the ACC. They never appeal an approval, so they're appealing a disapproval of an ACC decision. That appeal is heard by the Board of Directors. The Board of Directors can do one of three things. They can say, we agree with the ACC. They can say, well, you know, we appreciate the ACC's decision, but we're going to change that decision. Hopefully just maybe slightly, but they have the authority to change and overrule the ACC. Or they can do, and this is using terms from appeals courts, they can remand it back to the ACC. In other words, they can say, we hear what you're saying, homeowners, why you disagree, we understand that, we hear that. We're going to ask you to resubmit with these changes back to the ACC, and we're going to ask the ACC to reconsider based on the new application. So that's remanding it back. Those are the three options that are available to the board when they're listening to an appeal. We're going to move on to guidelines now, and keep in mind, if you have any questions, just chat them in and Tina will ask them. Let's move on to guidelines. These are such an important tool for associations and ACCs relative to making your job easier and owners understanding better. So both the CC&Rs and the Texas Property Code provide the authority for board members, for the board and or the ACC to create guidelines. These guidelines, once they're created, have all of the authority of the underlying documents. They're not just, yeah, these are some rules and you can agree to them or not. No, these are as binding as the CC&Rs. Once they are written and adopted by either the board or the ACC, whoever has the authority in that particular situation, they must be obviously in writing. They must be filed in the county that the community resides in. If a community is in 2 counties, you file it in both counties. Must be filed in the county public records. And they must be posted on the association's website if you have it. If you're one of our clients, obviously you have our website and it's filed in, let's say, Bexar County and on our website. Guidelines are extremely important, and these are the 4 reasons why they're so powerful and important. First of all, it provides owners with a clear understanding of what the requirements are for a particular improvement. Your documents might say that outbuildings, storage sheds must be approved and can be no larger than 120 square feet. Maybe it says that much. Maybe it just says that structures need to be approved. That doesn't help me when I go down to Home Depot and I'm looking at all those beautiful, sheds that they have sitting out there, and I want to buy one. I have no idea if I can put that particular storage building on my property. But a guideline can be written to indicate size, shape, color, appearance, location on the lot. And then an owner in advance already knows what the requirements are. They're not going to buy a 400 square foot storage building when they know 120 is all that's allowed. They'll buy the 120. Maybe they won't submit it. That's a whole nother issue. But at least they put in something because we've clarified for them what the requirements are. This does avoid situations where an owner unknowingly begins an unapprovable project. In that same example, they may not know when they place that order that this 400 square foot storage building will never be approved. If we have provided those guidelines, then we don't put them in the situation where they've now spent money, can't get a refund, and we're fighting them over something that costs them $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000. We want to avoid those situations. It provides for the ACC itself a basis for making consistent decisions over time as the ACC membership changes. You know, you may be lucky enough to have someone on the committee who's been there 5, 10, 15, 20 years and remembers everything that's ever been done. Chances are, at some point, that person won't be there. Chances are you'll have turnover in the ACC, and you won't be making decisions with the knowledge of what happened in the past, the passed along, handed down knowledge. But if you have written guidelines, the committee from yesterday, the committee from today, the committee from tomorrow can make consistent decisions based on what we have in writing. And then finally, if unfortunately we do need to go to court, those guidelines are evidence that absolutely get presented from the association side, indicating we communicated this, we have consistently enforced this over time, so judge, please take that into consideration when making a decision. So when we have something in writing like that, filed in the public records, it's been there for a while, we're going to be in a really good position when we need to pursue something in court. So specifically on a particular improvement, these guidelines will help us, for example, deal with the materials and design elements of a new home. You know, how much stone or brick do we need to have on a home? What roof shapes are appropriate? When we get into colors on painting and repainting your home, what are approvable colors? I'm going to give you a good example of that in just a moment. Play equipment, you know, where can they be? How big can they be? That beautiful play fort that I showed you earlier, would that be allowable if it were along a major boulevard or if it peered over a neighbor's fence and swimming pool? You know, what constraints do we have on placement and the height of play equipment? Storage buildings, what materials can be used? Now, it's important to recognize that we're not writing new law here, so to speak. We're not writing new CC&Rs, new deed restrictions. So guidelines cannot conflict with the deed restrictions. The deed restrictions will prevail if there's a conflict. What the deed restrictions, what we're doing with guidelines is we're expanding and clarifying what the deed restrictions already deal with. So for example, if the deed restrictions say that structures can be as close as 10 feet to the property line, we can't write a guideline that says, that's too close, we want them all at 15 feet. No, the deed restrictions allow 10, we can't provide that conflict. If the deed restrictions don't say anything at all about parking, we can't write a guidelines that says you can't park in the street. You just can't. That's creating new law, so to speak. But if the deed restrictions say that all structures must be approved, then we have the ability to say that storage sheds need to be approved, workshops need to be approved, and this is what we would approve on a storage shed or workshop. So that's the relationship between the CC&Rs and the guidelines that are so valuable. In your samples that we provided, there's a full set of architectural and deed restriction guidelines for Colony Grant. It's pretty old, it's probably 10 years old or more at this point, but it shows you one format that is very handy for creating guidelines. In this case, I spent a lot of time, wrote a 45-page pamphlet. The format was actually in a little booklet that was reproduced and sent out to everyone in the community once it was adopted. And if you look through that, you'll see that it covers everything from every single category. Painting, sheds, play equipment, swimming pools, on and on and on, all in one document. It's called Deed Restrictions and Architectural Guidelines because It also deals with violation type issues. So mowing your yard and pruning your trees and taking care of your shrubbery is not an architectural control issue. That's a maintenance issue. But since we're telling everyone what the expectations of the neighborhood are, it's useful to include a document that talks about those compliance type issues also. It talks about trash cans being out 3 days before trash day at the curb. It talks about maintaining your property. It talks about noise type issues. It talks about what we expect you to do in terms of maintaining your fence and things of that sort. So sometimes you want to include both ACC and compliance issues in one document as it's shown in that particular sample. The other samples that are in there deal with property code specific issues that I'll get to in a minute. But before I do that, what you're seeing on this particular slide are painting and house color guidelines that I think these are exactly from the Colony Grant document. It may be from another one, but they're very similar. So in the establishment clause for the ACC, it talks about alterations to property, that owners must get approval for alterations to property. And so painting is one of those things. And if your documents even talk about colors, they generally say, if it's from the 70s and 80s when your community was developed, it talks about earth tone colors. I don't know about you, but I actually tried this at one point. I went to Home Depot and said, I need to paint my house, I want an earth tone color. Since I didn't say I want a paint that's called earth tone, they led me to the browns and got me to the right place. But you really can't, if you're a homeowner, you can't go to Home Depot, ask for an earth tone color, walk away with a can and know that it's going to be an approvable color. Especially if you were born in Arizona and you come here, you're going to get an orange. You're going to get a red. If you're from the Sedona part of Arizona, you're going to get a red. And you say that's earth tone. If you live in Houston, you're going to say bright red is not earth tone. So instead of getting into that argument, you can create guidelines that are shown here. Since there are literally millions and millions of colors that are possible, you can't name every acceptable color, but you can talk about tones. You can talk about garage doors must be painted the same color as a house, that you can have accent colors, that you don't want gloss paint on the exterior of the house. You can't paint your brick. Whatever your comments are relative to painting and house colors, you can put it in words that people will understand that will give them additional guidance. So that's what you're trying to achieve when you create guidelines, is better communication with the owners. Well, let's move on to the Texas Property Code, the TPC. And starting in the 82nd legislative session in 2011, there were a number of changes to the Texas Property Code which created obligations for associations to create guidelines. I'm going to say why in a minute, but let me first name the 8 categories which are addressed in Chapter 202 of the Texas Property Code, which deal with guidelines. Display of certain religious items. It's a very narrow law. It deals with, specifically, it was written relative to the mezuzah. That's the photo that you see right at the left-hand side, which is from the Jewish faith. When we have written the guidelines that are required by the law or recommended under the law, we have also included the Toran, which is a Hindu item. And so certain religious items deals with that. Display of flags. The whole purpose of that law was to protect the right of any person in Texas to fly 7 specific flags: the Texas flag, the U.S. flag, and then the 5 flags of the armed services of the United States. And so the associations should have created guidelines related to flags and flagpoles. Drought-resistant landscaping was something that came in 2013. Sometimes we refer to xeriscaping, but the law talked about a more broad, anything that's drought-resistant or natural turf, which is needs less water. That's how the law was phrased. And so we generically talk about xeriscaping guidelines. Many years ago, actually before the 2011 session, law went into place relative to political signage. That political signage is allowed for one candidate or ballot issue. An owner can place one sign for each candidate or ballot issue on their property from 90 days in advance of that election until 10 days after. And so guidelines are very important there. In a moment, I'll say again how important. The 5th one is rainwater recovery systems. So that includes rain barrels, rainwater storage tanks, and things of that sort. Roofing materials was very specific relative to impact-resistant shingles, wind-resistant shingles, and energy-efficient shingles. And it only has to do with composition shingles, but it was something that state law said you really need these guidelines. Number 7 is solar energy devices. We typically think of solar panels, but it will cover anything that uses solar energy to create another form of energy, such as electricity, or a mechanical advantage. So you could, for example, heat water, have a grid on your roof that would circulate water and provide hot water for your home, for your swimming pool, or whatever. That would also fall into that law. And number 8, which came in more recently in 2015 legislative session, was for the right for owners to have standby electric generators at their property. So those are the 8 categories of which the Texas Property Code specifically addresses these. And I've said that it's highly recommended. Texas Property Code doesn't require you to create these guidelines, but it's highly recommended for this reason. All of them, except for one, which you'll see the little asterisk there at the bottom, all of them except for xeriscaping, all of them say essentially this: that no association may prohibit these items, period. You cannot tell someone they cannot have a rainwater recovery system. You cannot tell someone they can't have, solar panels. However, if you create written guidelines and you file them in the public records of the county and post them on your website, then you can regulate these items to the extent required. And you might say, well, okay, so what are you telling me here? Why is that so important? Let me give you an example. And the example being roofing shingles. And this example is going to be in the Houston area, and it's a really real example. So the roofing guidelines requirement under Chapter 202 was passed in the 82nd legislative session in 2011. It went into effect June 26, 2011. Shortly thereafter, and anyone from the Houston area will remember, shortly thereafter we had a devastating hurricane come through and do great damage in a whole lot of the Houston area. There's routinely hurricanes there, but 2011 we had one, 2008 I believe we had Hurricane Ike was in 2008. But when these big windstorms come through, one of the things they like to do is knock down fences and tear off roofs. That happens. And the way that law was written went into effect June 26, 2011. It said that if an association does not create and publish and file these guidelines, an association may not prohibit a person from putting essentially any type of roof shingles they want on the house. That's the state law. It doesn't matter that your document says a new roof needs to be approved by the ACC. State law said you can't say anything if you don't have these guidelines. So, one of the impacts of that law I mentioned was it said that you can't prohibit someone from putting energy efficient shingles on a roof. So, hurricane comes through, we have all these beautiful subdivisions that all have weathered wood colored shingles, gray shingles. That's the most common color in Houston, weathered wood. There are others, but weathered wood. It's gray, medium gray. Hurricane comes through, an association doesn't have any guidelines. An owner argues that these white shingles are energy efficient. It keeps my attic cooler. You can't tell me I can't have white. So all of a sudden we have a bunch of white shingles showing up in the community. After a hurricane, dozens, hundreds of white shingles. All of a sudden it looks a little different in the community. If you create guidelines, one of the things the law says is that you can require that whatever shingles the person puts on their house must essentially fit in with what would otherwise be approved. In other words, you could put a requirement that they be weathered wood color or gray as opposed to white. So that's why the law is so important. Up here in the hill country, it's very important that we grab every bit of rain that comes on the ground, so many people have rainwater recovery systems. If you don't have guidelines for rainwater recovery systems, then a homeowner could literally drop 3 5,000-gallon tanks, rainwater recovery tanks, at the curb, right on their property, not on the road right-of-way, but on their property, and pipe all the water that comes off their roof into those. Why would they put them there? Well, 2 reasons. One is maybe it's hard to get to the back of their property, and so it's cheaper to drop them there. Or they just don't like the association and they want to show you, and they happen to know what the law says. And so they just drop them right out there. Clearly, those would not be attractive. 3 tanks of that size are going to be approximately 25 feet across and 8 feet tall. It would not be attractive. So I just wanted to emphasize and emphasize and emphasize the need to have all of these guidelines in place. Again, xeriscaping is the only one that's not required in order to regulate. But if that's an issue for you, you may want to create xeriscaping guidelines too. Lots of examples of those. 7 of those examples are in the handout that we provided. Okay, we're going to switch gears now. We're about halfway through at this point, and still would love to have some questions. I know that several of you have some questions, and I'm going to be probably prompting a few more as we talk about enforcement, which comes up in a moment. But let's talk about online applications for a moment. One of the things that C.I.A. Services launched in 2004 is our really nice home improvement application system on our website. What's really nice about it is that it's not just a piece of paper you fill out. It's not some generic form. You tell the system what you want to do, and that it asks you questions about what you want to do. It's kind of like TurboTax for associations. It leads you through the process. And so it's really nice. Since we launched it in 2014, right now close to 50% of our applications, and we bring in about, in 18 or 17, we'll probably have about 8,000 applications that we've processed through our offices, and about half of those are coming in online. One of the greatest benefits, certainly it helps the homeowner, it's more convenient for the homeowner, there's no mailing time, it gets to us immediately. But one of the greatest benefits for you as an Architectural Control Committee member or a board member is it greatly reduces the number of incomplete applications that we receive. You know, if we just give someone a form, they say, I'm painting my house the same color, and turn the form back. We have no idea what the color is. They didn't send a photo, they didn't send a paint chip. Whereas if they're submitting an online application, it's asking you for the color. It's asking you to attach a paint chip, to attach a photograph of your house. And so when we get the application that we then pass on to the ACC, it's already complete. So we've greatly reduced the number of incomplete applications that the ACC needs to work with, or the delay in getting it approved because we're going back and forth with the homeowner trying to get that additional information. If you haven't gone to the website, and I'm not going to show you the application here now, but if you haven't gone to the website and tried it out, please do. Just go to your community, go to any community you want to. Just at the end, don't hit submit. But go to any community. The one I normally suggest for folks, because it's a really good example, is just go on there and say you want to put a new roof on your house. So on that screen that you see right there, there's a drop down, and just say you want to put on a roof. It'll then go through and it asks you questions relating to roofing. Many of them are yes or no questions. And what's really cool is if you don't know a word that we're using, like how many know what a ridge vent is? Probably most of you. How about a drip edge? How about the roof jacks? You may not know those terms. So over on the right-hand side of the screen, it's always showing you what these things are. Do you know the difference between a 3-tab shingle and a laminated shingle? Well, it'll show you. And so it's really helpful for the owner to be able to very easily submit their application. At the end, they attach paint chips, they attach surveys, they attach brochures, they attach the bid from the roofer, whatever they want. And at the very end, finally, they put in their name and can submit everything. So the online application process is a really nice thing for homeowners, and I'd ask that all of you, if you haven't tried it, go in and just play with it. Just don't hit submit at the end because we will process your application. Okay, we're ready for a question, I believe. Tina, do you have a question for me?
Yes, Ralph, this is from Richard. And if building restrictions are covered in the CC&Rs, do you need to repeat the same information in a guideline?
Oh, really good question. Thank you, Richard. The documents definitely stand alone. This document plus this document creates all of the obligations of the owner. However, this document, being the CC&Rs, is very hard to read. This document, being the guidelines, is written in your words. It's written in words that are understandable. It uses terms that are not legal terms, not generic terms. It uses very specifics. So our recommendation always is to take anything that's in the CC&Rs relative to this subject and repeat them over here. It may be just stating those same words. The setback must be 40 feet on the front and 20 feet on the right and left side and 30 feet on the back. You're just repeating what's there, and it may actually be on the plat that you're repeating it from, but it puts it into one place. So you're not asking the owner to both look at your guidelines and then look at any place else there might be information that's applicable. You put it in one place. So great question. And that's our approach, is we want to make it easier for the owner to know what all the obligations are relative to this topic. Wonderful. Thank you, Richard and Tina. Well, let's talk about, so now we're getting those applications in. We've hopefully communicated well with the homeowners and the property owners as to what the obligations are by creating great guidelines, and an owner submits an application. We'll take it any way it comes in, whether it's online, whether it's mailed to us, faxed to us, hand delivered to us, carrier pigeon, however it gets to us, we're happy to receive it. We have not received any by carrier pigeon. Drone is coming up, I'm sure. But we receive it any way that it comes in. We log in that application. That's the first thing we do. We log it into our system so we have the date it starts. We do an initial review to ensure that the application is complete. So we have our staff who processes the applications. They handle a lot, obviously, so they know what's required. If we're missing the paint chips, they'll contact the owner for paint chips. If we're missing a plat that's showing the location of this improvement on the property, they'll contact the owner. So they'll try to get that missing information. If it comes in online, there's generally less that is missing. After that's done, then generally the community manager is the one who will review that application at that point and sometimes add comments to assist the Architectural Control Committee. So if I'm, for example, reviewing an application for putting a new roof on the house, my comments might be 71817-Troiano- new roof meets published guidelines, no concerns. Just a few words that will say to the ACC, someone has looked at this more than just in a cursory way. Someone has looked at this and is recommending to you that there are no concerns here and you could approve it unless you see something else. That's an easy one, roofing. When we get into other things, there may be much more extensive comments relative to how this fits in with the deed restrictions or guidelines, or even other laws. So if someone submits a satellite dish, then we would be commenting on what federal law says about satellite dishes, which may actually be overriding what your own deed restrictions say. So we add those comments. We then email that application to whoever is appropriate in that particular community. So in some communities, we have a chairperson or an email address that's associated for the committee, and we simply submit it to that person or entity. In other cases, the committee wants it sent to all 3 members or all 5 members, and we do that. And in some cases, it actually is passed on to someone in our office who has been given limited authority to review it. So the application, once logged and reviewed, goes for a decision. The ACC reviews it, makes a decision. That could be done via email, via meetings. There's various ways committees like to work with each other, and everyone is a valid way of working together. Once that decision is made, the ACC then conveys that decision back to us in writing, almost always via email, but sometimes other ways. So we have that decision, and that decision will include, we have approved it, we have disapproved it, we've approved it with conditions, or we need more information. Those are the 4 dispositions that there might be for this application. And the ACC lets us know if they approve it with conditions, what those specific conditions are. Often those conditions are in shorthand. Needs to notified neighbor. We'll add some verbs and some adjectives in there so it's a full sentence for when it goes back to the owner. And sometimes it is written out in very detailed, full sentences, full paragraphs, and we simply will paste what the ACC has told us into the letter. Whichever way it comes in, our objective is to make sure that the decision of the ACC is clear to the owner who receives that. So we issue that response letter. We log in whatever the decision was. We issue the response letter. The letters always go by mail. In many cases, we will also send a letter by email. We'll simply take that exact same letter that we put in the mail and we will email it to the owner. It's not a separate email that says, oh, by the way, it's been approved, you'll get a letter in the mail. They will get the actual letter via email. If it happens to be a disapproval, that is sent by certified mail to the owner. And that's really important. An owner may be offended that, well, why did you send this by certified mail? It's really important that we document that that owner has received this disapproval. What we don't need is for an owner to not receive a letter of disapproval and to say, oh, it's been 30 days, so I guess I've been approved, and go on with their project. And then we're into a fight because they just claim they didn't receive it. Maybe they didn't receive it, or maybe they received it, were so mad they threw it away and went on with their project and now are claiming they didn't receive it. So that's why it goes by certified mail. We just want to protect the association. Now, we talked about deadlines earlier. We talked about why default approvals are not something we want to have happen. And this is why. No matter what the deadline, we need to have a response out. So let's talk about when the stopwatch starts and when it ends. So what triggers a complete application? And that's it. It's when we receive a complete application. We don't log it in when someone says, hey, I'm going to paint my house the same color. And they just send us an email, no application, no details. We would respond back saying, oh great, here's an application, go online, fill it out, make sure you attach this. So when we have a complete application, that's when the clock starts. The ACC defines that, not the owner. The owner can't say it's the same color. That should be enough for you. So it's when we have a complete application. The clock stops when the letter is issued, not when the ACC makes a decision. So if the ACC makes a decision on Friday night, we don't get that letter out until Monday. And so when the letter goes out is when the clock stops. It's not when the owner receives it. So if they don't receive it till 3 or 4 or 5 days later, that's not when the clock stops. Complete decision starts, letter out the door stops. Now, we already talked about default approvals, where it's approved if no decision is made. We always recommend, even if the ACC maybe got behind or something happened where a decision wasn't made, and we'll follow up as it's getting closer to the response deadline. Have you made a decision yet? But even if it goes beyond the deadline, it's really important that a response letter goes out. Would the owner have an argument if they did something that was unacceptable and we got the letter out late? Yep, they absolutely would. But we want to get it in their hands. If there are conditions on that approval, or if there's a disapproval, we want that owner to know. We want it on record that we notified them, maybe late, but we notified them. We're going to be in a better position to then deal with any issues that may come up. And as I stated earlier, a missed deadline doesn't give anyone the authority to violate the restrictions. So whether we answer or not, if someone puts up that 8-foot fence where only 6 foot is allowed, we have a perfect right to require them to lower the fence. The decisions, as I indicated earlier, must always be in writing, and I would very, very strongly recommend that nobody, certainly no one in our office, but no one on the ACC or the Board of Directors, convey a verbal decision. And the reason is this. If, let's say, someone wants to put in a storage building and the ACC says, yeah, you can put it in, but on your plat you showed it was going to be 6 feet from the sideline, it needs to be 10 feet, so if you just would move it over 4 feet. That's the decision that would be put in writing. But when that owner calls you and says, hey Larry, did the ACC approve my storage shed because I want to go, get it built today, I want to pour the foundation? And you say, yeah, it's been approved. You just need to move it back 4 feet. As soon as you say the word approved, their ears are closed. They haven't heard the rest of it. And so, when we go to court, and that would never go to court, but when we go to court, they would say, Larry told me it was approved. And you'll say, but I said it needed to be moved back. And that's where the disagreements come in. So please don't give verbal approvals. If someone wants something today in writing, and it's not a weekend, give us a call. We'll email them the letter if we had put it in the mail. We'll work with the homeowner, absolutely, but we want to have things in writing. It's very important that communication we send back is very clear. If there are conditions, we want those conditions to be shown clearly as a requirement of the approval. It's approved with the following conditions: that it may be moved to 10 feet from the property line. If we disapprove it, it's extremely important we let the owner know why it's disapproved. We don't want it to be a mystery. We don't want them to have to guess what to resubmit. We should be very clear that, well, it's been disapproved because it is too high, it's the wrong color. Please go with an, quote, earth tone color. Please refer to our guidelines regarding solar panels on your roof and the locations they may be. So whatever it is, we want to be very clear and helpful to give them an opportunity to resubmit that application so it will be approved, so they'll know what needs to be changed. And if there is additional information needed, we need to list everything that's needed. The most frustrating thing for a homeowner is when we say, thank you for submitting your application for a swimming pool, you need to submit a plat showing us where it is relative to the easements. And they send it in and we say, oh, by the way, we also need to know where you're going to be putting your circulation equipment. Is it going to be screened from view? So could you mark that on the plat? Yes. And for them to continually have to submit additional information, when we see the application, we know exactly what's missing. So let's make sure that if we send it to you as the ACC and there's additional information you want, look at everything you might want and list it all. And that way we can be very clear to the homeowner and be able to process their request quickly. They absolutely appreciate when we're specific with them and we're trying to help them get it through the process. And then, finally, if there are any limitations on the decision, we've got to list those. In the case study, so I'm going to give you a hint, keep this in mind. In the case study, this particular thing was a big flaw in what we'll be looking at. But sometimes someone will say, hey, I want to put in a barn. And this is about what it's going to look like. Is that approvable? And they submit something and you look at it and you say, yeah. They may simply want a conceptual approval to see whether or not they're going to hire an architect to design it. But you need to be very clear that this is a conceptual approval. This is not an approval for construction. Before that, we will need your specific plans, the placement on the lot, and all of those things. So conceptually, can you build a barn? Yes, but we need specifics. Maybe they have submitted, and this happens with swimming pools all the time, they will submit the plans that were provided to them by their contractor that have the swimming pool laid out on the property nicely so we know where it is relative to the height, the house and the property lines. But they'll also have this beautiful lanai over here and an outdoor kitchen over there, and they submit that. But really you think they're just asking for approval for the pool, and maybe they really are. You'll want to say on your approval that it's approved. However, this is for the pool only. If you eventually want to put in the lanai and the outdoor kitchen, those will need to be submitted separately. Otherwise, he'll say, heck, it was on the plans, you approved my plan, so I'm building this lanai over here right next to my neighbor and on the easement. So we need to be careful of those little pitfalls that we can run into. And then subsequent submissions. On new homes, it's not unusual for us to get plans for the home, but they are not ready to put together their landscaping plans. If landscaping is important and something the ACC would review, then we would say, your house is approved. Please be aware that prior to occupancy, you must submit plans and put your landscaping in, or whatever it might be. Okay, so that's the review process and the importance of communicating clearly with the owners. We have, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, 4 standard letters that we put out: approved as submitted, a conditional approval, which will be approved, but certain conditions must be met or changes must be done, disapproval, or temporarily disapproved for more information. I'm going to show you those letters in a disclaimer paragraph in just a minute, but let me answer a question first. Tina, do we have a question?
We have Matt, who asked, if a homeowner builds a shed and plants a tree without submitting an ACC application as required, they can't be seen from the front of the house, and it was discovered years later after a neighbor complained about the shed, and the tree was very close to the fence, and its big branches are over their backyard. What can be done at this point about the shed and the tree? Can you still go after a very old violation?
Matt, I've got to congratulate you in bringing 3 different webcasts into that question. That's a great question. Some of those answers I'm actually going to be giving you here in about 10 minutes. So I'm going to identify that part, give the answer later. And that has to do with what if someone does something without the association's approval that should have been approved. So I'll deal with that in a moment. You asked about a tree that was planted very close to a fence that was seen later. The whole question of whether or not a tree even falls under the authority of the ACC is in that establishment clause. Does the ACC have the authority to regulate landscaping such as trees? The other thing you brought up was relative to something that was done a long time ago. In our practical deed restriction seminar, we talk about statute of limitations. Statute of limitations is a concept under the law that says if you don't take action against this item within a certain period of time, then you are barred by law from taking that action. So in the situation of community associations and property owners associations, the statute of limitations is 4 years. Again, we need to talk about when the clock starts and when the clock ends for that 4-year statute. So the clock starts when you knew about this or should have known about this. Let me explain that. When you should have known about it, if someone built that shed in their front yard, and you can't have sheds in your front yard, let's say, then when you should have known about it is the day it went up. Someone should have noticed the day it went up. That's when the clock would have started if they put it right in the front yard. If they put it in the backyard, where the association's management company, the board of directors never saw it, that person did not have any board members or ACC members around them that would have seen it over their fence, then the statute of limitations begins when it was brought to the association's attention that we have this issue. So that shed could be 10 years old, but if today it's finally brought to our attention that we have a shed that is somehow in violation of the restrictions, that's when the clock starts. When does the clock end? It's not when we send a letter to the owner saying, hey, take down that shed. The clock doesn't end until we file a lawsuit. So it's not our letters, it's not an attorney demand letter, it ends at the day we file the lawsuit. So that's what the picture is. We'll touch on things that haven't been submitted in just a minute. Thank you very much, Matt. And there's one more follow-up question on that one, or maybe two. What is it, Tina?
Okay, this is from Jim. To further Richard's question that was on the building restrictions about repeating CCRs in the guidelines, what if one's development has multiple CCRs differing by section up to 7? Would it not be better to refer the owner builder back to the specific CCR?
Another wonderful question. I know exactly who's asking this, so thank you. This is a very practical question that's being asked. So we have a multitude of sets of restrictions for a particular association. I think our largest number is probably 80, would you say, Tina? We have one association with about 80 different sets of restrictions, maybe more, but about that. And so would it be practical to write a guideline that covered all 80 of those? Maybe not, but maybe. Again, if our objective is to make it as easy as possible for an owner to understand the obligations, then we would want to consider whether or not we could do that. You know, could we, in that extreme situation, have a spreadsheet, printed in there with 80 rows in it? You know, in this section, it's a 10-foot setback. In this one, it's an 11.5-foot setback, and all those parameters. We could. When we're at only 7 sections, it's very easily doable to create that. And in fact, if you look at the sample I gave you for the Colony Grant architectural guidelines, that is an example where they have 4 or 5 sections, and they had different square footages in different sections. And so there's actually tables in there that deal with that particular issue. With that stated, our objective would be to make it easy for the owner. From the same standpoint, one of the objectives of guidelines is to make it easy on the ACC. So wouldn't it be easier on the ACC if they could just look at, section 5B is this, 5D is this, 1 is that, all in one little table. So I would encourage that you absolutely do take all of that relevant information and summarize it in the guidelines. So good question. And I'll be meeting with that board in a couple weeks, so thanks for asking the question first. Okay, let's go on and look at the letters. This is an approval letter. It has a decision and a place for comments. A conditional approval letter has the decision approved as, conditionally approved as described below, and then it has the various conditions. A disapproval letter, up top you'll see it's going by certified and first class mail, and then it gives the reason for disapproval, and then finally, if more information is needed, it says return the application with the following information. So those are just letters. You'll notice each one looks a little different. They look a little different because some of them have our letterhead on it. Some of them have a custom letterhead for a community. So our system will handle all of those. And even the wording in there, I don't know if any of these examples show it, but if you're if you look at the disapproval one, Telfair has a design review committee as opposed to the Highlands has an architectural control committee. So it'll insert the right name of the committee in there, and it could be customized further if needed. But one thing that every single letter has is this disclaimer paragraph. It's identical on every single letter that goes out, whether it's an approval, disapproval, or anything in between. It has this standard legal disclaimer. The red parts that are out there give you the key essence of this long paragraph. It says the ACC shall not be deemed to constitute any warranty. The decision shall not be a warranty of or representation by the ACC of the fitness of whatever you're wanting to do. So we're not saying it's going to stand up. We're just saying it meets our requirements. The next one says that neither the ACC, its members, the agents shall be liable for anything relating to this. So don't sue us because it fell down. Don't sue us because we delayed you in bringing your horse to the property because it didn't have a barn, whatever it might be. And then the last part says that the property owner is responsible for complying with everything else that's out there. All we're responding to is the association's requirements. If there's a city, county, or other requirement, it's your responsibility to do that. It's your responsibility to respect the easements and things of that sort. So that is on every single letter that goes out, and it's just the disclaimer. So we're going to spend the last about 20 minutes talking about enforcing decisions, and then we're going to get into the case study. So let's go ahead and talk about responsibility. What is the ACC's responsibility? As I already indicated, they render decisions, possibly inspect projects. Maybe they try to work out issues with a homeowner who, in the middle of construction, maybe of a new home, comes up with an issue. The ACC sometimes gets involved and just tries to work those out, get anything else approved for the homeowner to help them out. The ACC does not enforce compliance. That's not your role, and you don't want that role. You've got enough. The ACC has a big job to start with. Let the board take over the enforcement part. So once a problem occurs, then it gets logged into our system as a compliance issue, as a deed restriction violation. And it's the board's job to take it from there. And problems fall into three different categories. So it can be that construction is occurring without approval. That's the most common one. The example that was brought up earlier, where someone puts a shed in, it never got through the ACC, and now it's determined to be a problem. Construction after disapproval. So the ACC has disapproved it, the owner does it anyway. Or more likely, the owner has done something that's not approvable, the ACC finally is aware of it, makes a decision, and disapproves it. So we have something that's on the ground already that is not acceptable. It's been disapproved. And then the last option is maybe the construction is not what the plan said. They've made changes to what they submitted, or the ACC put conditions on the approval and they haven't complied with those conditions. So those are the three things that can run into problems where the association and the board have to enforce some sort of compliance. Each one is different, so I'm going to handle each one separately. There's a lot of words here, so I'm going to just give you kind of the summary of what we do. So if we have construction or something that's occurred without approval, then normally that's detected by our, normal drive-arounds. We're driving through the community, we see something happening. We see shingles delivered sitting on a driveway. I bet they're about to put a new roof on the house, and we don't have an application. A neighbor complains about a lot of banging in the backyard next door, and all of a sudden they see studs sticking up over the fence, and they call that in. A board member or ACC member gets a call from a neighbor or sees something. So somehow it's detected. At that point, we contact the owner. If it's a relatively minor thing, then we'll send them a letter. Say, hey, looks like you're putting a roof on the house. Please go submit an online application or whatever it might be. They submit the form and it's processed normally. If it's approved, great. Barely no harm, no foul, let's move on. Maybe the next time they'll understand they need to submit it. Now, if it's clearly approvable, they put on a new roof, it's weathered wood, it's laminated shingles, it's what it needs to be, and they don't submit the application, we have an outstanding violation sitting out there. And so what do we do at that point? Well, we can pursue the paperwork, we can send a certified letter, send them to the attorney for not turning in the paperwork. That's kind of absurd. So if it's clearly approvable, we'll do one of two things. And it really depends on the community and the ACC and how adamant they are that everything gets documented. So in one scenario, the owner hasn't submitted, we will just let it go away. We'll close the violation, we'll document it that it's an approvable improvement, and we'll just close the violation. The other option that we sometimes take is we will, for a roof for example, we'll get a nice photo of the violation of the roof. We'll fill out an application for the owner, we'll attach the photo, we'll send it to the ACC and get the ACC to make an official decision on this. So those are the two ways that we'll take care of a item that was started without a submission and the owner did not submit when we asked them to. Okay, so that's all the easy side. They did something they didn't submit and it was okay. The more important one and the more challenging one is where the owner is starting to do something that is clearly not approvable, or we suspect it's not approvable. And so in that case, it's really important that we stop them immediately. We don't want them to spend any more money. So if we see someone putting a carport on the front of a house, and carports are not allowed, we want to stop them quickly. We don't want them to continue and then have to fight it out in court. If we see them knocking down the front of the house like they're putting on a room addition, okay, stop immediately. And so that's a situation, and it's an extreme situation, but we want to stop them where we would proceed with what we refer to as a cease and desist letter. A cease and desist letter is very strong and it is physically hand delivered to them immediately, the day that we're aware that this is occurring. Simultaneous to us getting ready to deliver this letter, we will have contacted the board of directors and or the ACC, let them know what's happening so that they can get their eyes on it too. And we would have gotten approval for them from the board to immediately turn this over to the attorney if they don't stop construction. So we hand deliver the cease and desist letter to the property. Many times the owner isn't home, we hand it to the contractor and tape it on the door. If we have email addresses or phone numbers, We will email it to them, we'll fax it to them, we'll call them, we'll get someplace that we can get this piece of paper in their hand. And that cease and desist letter says, stop immediately. If work continues 24 hours from now, we'll put an actual date and time in there, then the board of directors has already approved for the attorney to go to the courthouse, file a temporary restraining order to stop the work. Again, it's very strong. You don't want to just toss around the word cease and desist orders, because this is what it means. You've already approved going to court on this to stop it. You want to stop the owner from doing something that is going to cost them a lot of money and not be approved. I don't know every cease and desist letter that we have sent out in the 33 years that we've been managing communities, but I do know that in 100% of the cases where I have ever sent a cease and desist letter out, the work immediately stopped. The letter is that strong, and frankly, that's scary for someone who's, trying to do something. And then we deal with the issue at that point. So that's our approaches if things are done without being submitted. What if construction occurs after disapproval? Well, what most often happens is they've already done the work. Maybe they put the new shingles on the house. It happens in one day. The product is delivered. By the end of the day, the roof is done. And we look up and we say, gee, that's a 3-tab shingle. It's required to be a laminated shingle. And so we go through the process to try to get the owner to submit. If they don't submit, we'll submit for the owner. The committee will disapprove it. And at that point, we need to go through the whole process of potentially going to court to have that roof replaced on the house. The person has just paid $5,000 maybe for a 3-tab shingle roof. If it's a really big house, it could be a $9,000 investment. But if they put the wrong shingles on, it's a problem. So where we are in that situation is, more likely than not, the owner is not going to be cooperative when we say, redo your roof. They're not going to want to spend an extra $5,000 after they just spent $5,000 and have a new substandard roof on their house. And so we end up fighting over that. It may go to the attorney. The attorney sends a demand letter. The board at some point is going to need to make a decision as to whether or not to pursue this. They're going to need to make a decision along with the attorney, which is a business judgment. Because the owner's saying no, and if we have to go to court, a judge is going to make that decision. It's going to cost a lot of money, and there's no guarantee we're going to win in court. Just because our documents clearly say you can't use 3-tab shingles doesn't mean a judge is going to side for us, because a judge will take into account everything involved here. And one of the issues they'll take into account is equity. What equity means is, what is the harm to this defendant, $5,000, versus the harm to the community? You got this roof that hardly anyone can tell the difference, and he's got trees all around it. No one's going to know. It is not harming the community. That would be what could be going through the judge's mind. And if the judge rules against you, you've lost several $1,000s in legal fees. You haven't set a precedent, so that's not something you need to worry about. But there is going to be that decision that the board will need to make as to whether or not to pursue it. Let me do this last section on, and then we've got a question waiting. But this last section is construction not in compliance with the ACC conditions or with the plans that they originally submitted. This one is actually pretty difficult to detect. And the reason is that unless someone is actually monitoring that construction, you're not going to notice that they have placed it a few feet one direction or another, or that the foundation appears to be a little larger than what you thought it was. And so the bottom line on this one, you may never know. But if you do catch this, if it's something that was important and so you're watching to see that they actually do, move this shed back, or that they do screen the pool equipment, whatever it might be, then as soon as we notice this discrepancy, we, the management company, need to know so that we can contact the owner about the discrepancy. Many times they'll say, oh yeah, I changed that. Let me resubmit. And it could be that it's totally acceptable. It's just that the ACC needed to look at that change. Or it may be that, yeah, I forgot to put the fence in front of the pool equipment. I will do it. So when we notice those discrepancies, it's very important that we deal with those. We don't want to just let things slide, or people will think that the ACC doesn't care what I do. And we have a question.
Ready? Okay, this is from Cecil. We have a development with several sections. The CC&Rs for each section has a design guidelines section that says, the criteria and guidelines established by the ACC for the construction and landscaping improvements and commercial development improvements within the subdivision. In our case, no guidelines have ever been established for landscaping. Can we now develop guidelines for landscaping?
Wonderful. The establishment clause that I talked about earlier is going to provide the limitations on what improvements are that the ACC can comment on. And although I'm very familiar with that community, I'm not very familiar with the answer to that question. So I'm not going to give you the specific answer here because I don't know. However, the fact that you can create builder guidelines, that phrase right there is a whole different, introduces a whole different additional set of authorities for you. So it's very possible that under the restrictions for Bridlegate Ranch, that you do have the authority to, on new construction, require landscaping. The question would then be, could you do that on existing properties? So good question, and looking to the governing documents will help answer that. Great. Thank you. Let's look at this last part here, and then I want to quickly go through some appeals reports and then jump into the case study. So, at the very bottom here, we talk about monetary incentives. So one of the things that we have in some communities is the ability to insert money into the equation to help people do what we'd like them to do relative to submitting plans or complying with rules and things like that. So some associations actually charge an application fee. Generally, they're doing that so they can raise revenues. The problem with application fees is it's going to discourage people from submitting anything. If they have to pay $50 for, submitting an application to put up a storage shed, they're more likely to just put up the storage shed and save $50. I know, sometimes management companies have a application fee that it goes to them. In that case, the association can't do anything about it, but if you have an application fee for your own association, generally not a great idea. However, some associations, as part of their builder guidelines or new construction guidelines or architectural guidelines, have construction deposits as part of their guidelines. So it's required that if you're going to build a new home, you need to put down a $5,000 construction deposit right up front before you break ground, before the ACC will render its decision on your plans. That construction deposit, and you won't want that on everything. You're not going to want a construction deposit if someone's painting their house. But on certain limited things, new home as an example, you would want it. And you use that construction deposit to ensure that they're following all the other rules you have for new construction, such as, you can't be building on Sundays, you can't build before 6 a.m., you can't build after dark, you need to keep the streets clean, you need to keep all of your construction debris contained, all of those things. And the great thing about a construction deposit is if they violate the rules that they have agreed to, then you don't have to chase after them to, get money. You already have their money. You just subtract that from their deposit. And then whenever the house is done, you give them back whatever's there. Just the fact that you have the deposit tends to help builders be very nice when otherwise they wouldn't have to be, because it's their money generally. Many times the homeowner requires that the builder put down the deposit instead of the homeowner. And then finally, some associations have the authority to assess fines for ACC type issues. As I just indicated, that kind of works best if you also have a construction deposit, because then you're not chasing the fines, you already have the money. Most associations don't have the authority to do those things. And finally, on appeals, an owner who disagrees with an ACC decision has the authority to appeal that decision to the board of directors. A lot of times, if they disagree with a decision, they'll talk to the community manager, they'll talk to members of the ACC, they'll kind of work things out. Well, what if I did this? And they say, oh yeah, that's great. And then it all gets worked out. It never gets appealed. An appeal happens when there's a stalemate. The ACC says this, the homeowner says, I disagree. They appeal to the board. And then there is a hearing process that we go through. When the hearing is held, it's held in executive session. The only ones at the hearing are the board, the manager, the homeowner, and if it's an ACC appeal, then a member of the ACC can be there to both observe and comment on their reason. An appeal is not a trial. The whole purpose of an appeal is try to communicate what the issues are and attempt to resolve the issues. Any decision is then put in writing. The next several things are sample reports. You've seen these, no reason for me to go over them. The ACC statistics report, I've got a couple things that are highlighted on here, is a really cool report that we do. We generally do it once a year, no reason to do it on a monthly basis. But once a year, maybe in January, we'll run a report for the whole prior year that has all sorts of numbers in it and statistics. So the type of applications that were submitted, the percent of all applications that were solar panels in this particular community, the numbers that were approved, conditionally approved, disapproved, needing more information, pending in total, the number of days it took for a decision. But the interesting stuff is the bottom line. So on the right-hand side, this particular community handled 121 applications in that year. And the average response time was 8 days. That is remarkable. That's from the date it hit our office. It got processed in our office, comments added, got to the ACC. The ACC reviewed it, made a decision, got the decision back to us, and a letter out the door. 8 is about the lowest number I've ever seen for a committee. So I hope everyone who's listening here strives to break that record. And then the other number at the bottom, it shows that in that case, 84% of all applications that came in were either approved or conditionally approved. So it gives you those statistics, which are nice. This just shows you that over about a 10-year period where we processed 77,000 applications, painting was the most common. 18% of all applications was painting. Swimming pools, 5%. Just interesting. But much more interesting is this case study. This case study is a community called Comanche Cliffs. And those of you in Hill Country know Comanche Cliffs. It's in Bandera County. And Comanche Cliffs has been self-managed forever. And we began managing them when this issue was out there. So basically, an owner submitted plans for a stucco house. And I'm going to show you the actual application and the response letter. There was no paint specified. The ACC approved the application. The CC&R state that all surfaces other than brick or stone must be coated with 2 coats of paint. The owner likes the way the house looks with just the plain concrete look to it. And the current board of directors doesn't like it. They want it painted. And so, your question, after listening to what we've done today, is to be the judge if this were to go to court. So let me show you the application. This is the application that came in. It was a 2-page application. This is page 1. Certain things are hidden to protect the innocent. But this was submitted in January of 2002 for a brand new house. It says the house will sit back 130 feet. The roof material will be shingles, but maybe it'll be metal. The exterior will be stucco with hardy, and the front elevation is shown. Here's the plans for the house. You have now seen the 2 pages of that application. There's nothing more. A few days later, very promptly, the application came in the middle of January. Very promptly, at 5 days later, the ACC, who was also the president, was on the ACC, responded, and it says that your request to build a house is approved. That's it. And then it says later on that construction must start within this time period and be finished with this time period. So that is basically what was submitted and what was sent back to them. And so all of you who are on an ACC will look at this and say, I don't think that application was complete. And now that you've heard this webcast, you might say, well, that letter that went back to them probably should have been a little longer. So here are the factors. Against the association, the application was absolutely incomplete. You didn't know where it was sitting on the lot. Was it too close to a property line? You didn't know much about it. You had some sketches on there. Didn't know what the roof was going to be like. The owner, but the application was submitted as approved. It wasn't conditionally approved. It didn't say, please submit some landscaping, please submit your house colors. And the owner relied on that clear approval from the ACC. Although the CC&Rs require painting, the current board, remember this was in 2002, the current board being 2010, complaining about this, was 8 years after it was clear that the house was not painted. So we're way beyond the statute of limitations that we're now trying to enforce. The application was totally unclear. It talked about, oh, in the future we're probably going to put in an arbor and a courtyard in the front. The response didn't say, oh, by the way, please submit those in the future. And it was approved unconditionally. So it was just a situation where when we came on board, our response to the board of directors in the ACC was very clear. move on. You have no ability to enforce this. The owner absolutely will fight you all the way. That had been clear from other things. And you have no legal standing to ask them to paint the property at this point. Move on. Don't have heartburn any longer, as they had for the last many years. So that's a case study in what not to do. Sometimes when you disapprove things, you get unexpected consequences. So in what I'm about to show you, this is a farm owner. This is a community where horses are allowed. However, the council in this particular case did not want to issue a permit to build a barn, a horse shelter. However, fortunately for the owner, you don't need a permit to build tables and chairs. So that right there is what the owner did, and those are full-size horses. Those aren't other horses. So for both Bridlewood Estates and Bridlegate Ranch, who both allow horses, beware. Don't disapprove a barn and get tables and chairs. Well, that brings us to 8 o'clock and the end of our webcast. I really appreciate all of you who've participated tonight. This webcast will be posted on YouTube in the next couple days. You can get to it through YouTube, you can get to it through our website. And so any of your fellow board members or fellow Architectural Control Committee members who haven't seen this, please invite them to take a look at it. With YouTube, you can, fast forward through the boring parts and get to the ones you want, but I'd encourage you to pass this around to many people. Our next webcast that's coming up is Advanced Topics for board members. Great topic if you're into all the legal intricacies and things like that. So I hope you join us. Thank you so much, and good evening.